On a crisp winter morning, the city pulsed with quiet energy, the hum of life threading through its bustling streets. Amidst the urban symphony, a high-end restaurant stood as a beacon of refinement, its pristine glass doors gleaming under the golden touch of the morning sun. Inside, an air of exclusivity wrapped around the establishment like an invisible veil. Elegantly dressed patrons sat in hushed conversations, their polished laughter mingling with the soft clinking of fine china. Waiters moved with effortless grace, their trays laden with exquisite meals, their steps perfectly choreographed to the unspoken rhythm of luxury. Every detail, every polished surface, every flickering candle, whispered of affluence. Then the doors swung open. A sudden gust of cold air sliced through the warmth, momentarily disrupting the seamless perfection within. A man stepped inside, his presence an unanticipated discord in the otherwise harmonious setting. His coat, though neatly fastened, bore the unmistakable signs of age, its frayed edges betraying years of wear. His shoes, though well kept, showed the weary marks of countless miles, their soles scuffed and tired. And yet, despite the clear contrast between him and his surroundings, there was something undeniably dignified about him. His posture remained upright, his gaze unwavering, and his movements deliberate. The lines on his face told a story, a lifetime of experience etched into his skin, while his eyes, deep and steady, carried a quiet strength that refused to be diminished by judgment. James Thornton, the restaurant's manager, noticed him immediately. James took pride in curating an environment of unparalleled sophistication, ensuring that only the most distinguished clientele graced his establishment. His well-trained eye, accustomed to quick assessments, lingered on the man's worn attire. A flicker of disapproval crossed his face, subtle yet telling. The corners of his lips pressed into a thin, displeased line as he straightened his posture, his polished shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor as he approached. He did not hesitate. "Excuse me," James said, his tone crisp, his voice low and firm. "We serve paying customers only." The man turned his head, meeting James's gaze with an expression unreadable, calm, yet unreadable. "I'd like to see the menu," he said, his voice quiet yet unshaken. James's frown deepened. He could feel the weight of the room shift, the quiet hum of conversation dwindling as the other patrons took notice. Some cast sideways glances, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Others, unwilling to be part of the moment, looked away, pretending not to see. James, sensing their attention, felt his irritation sharpen. He squared his shoulders, exhaling tightly as he glanced around the room before returning his gaze to the man before him. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he said, his voice growing colder. "I'll have to ask you to leave." The man did not flinch. He did not argue. He did not plead. Instead, he held James's gaze, searching his face for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I see," he murmured, his voice carrying neither anger nor resentment. There was something else in it, something quieter, something almost graceful. Without another word, he turned. His steps remained measured, unhurried, as he walked toward the door. A silence lingered in his wake, stretching between the walls of the restaurant like an invisible thread. As the door shut behind him, a hushed murmur rippled from a nearby table. "Wait," a young man whispered, leaning toward his companion, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Isn't that Elijah Carter?" But it was too late. The moment had passed. The door had closed. And the weight of what had just occurred settled heavily in the air, leaving the pristine restaurant to wrestle with an unease that would not soon fade. There was a quiet depth in the man's eyes, a steadiness that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried, challenges far greater than this moment. Yet he did not waver, did not argue, did not plead for understanding. Instead, he simply nodded, his voice low but unwavering. "I see. Thank you." With that, he turned away. His steps were unhurried, his back straight, his dignity untouched. Though he left without another word, something intangible seemed to linger in his absence. The air felt heavier, thick with the unspoken weight of what had just transpired. The soft click of the door closing behind him was deafening in the ensuing silence. That silence stretched, long and uneasy, until it was finally shattered by a hushed voice from a nearby table. "Wait," a young man whispered, leaning toward his companion, his expression taut with recognition. "Isn't that Elijah Carter?" The name sliced through the room like a sudden gust of wind, subtle yet electrifying. Conversations halted. Heads turned. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of quiet indulgence, was now charged with a new kind of energy. The murmurs began, tentative at first, then growing with urgency, as diners reached for their phones, fingers moving rapidly over screens. In mere moments, glowing displays lit up with headlines, articles, photographs. "Elijah Carter?" Someone breathed, their voice tinged with disbelief. "The philanthropist?" Another echoed, eyes wide as they scrolled. "The self-made millionaire," a voice murmured, as though speaking the words aloud made them more real. "He owns half the buildings in this district." James Thornton stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His mind reeled, replaying every second of the exchange with stark, unrelenting clarity. The worn coat, the scuffed shoes, the measured voice that had asked only for a menu, and the dismissal, his own sharp words, spoken without a second thought. A slow, creeping dread wrapped around his chest. He turned toward the door as though expecting it to swing open once more, as though hoping, praying, that the man might return, that he might have the chance to undo what had just been done. But the door remained still, and the weight of his mistake settled deeper onto his shoulders. The murmurs in the restaurant grew softer, but their meaning was no less damning. The elegant walls, the gleaming chandeliers, the polished floors, none of it felt as grand as it had mere minutes ago. In its place was an uncomfortable realization, one that no amount of refinement could mask. Then, a voice, louder than the rest, sharp and unfiltered, cut through the tension like a blade. "Do you even realize what you just did?" A young man, seated near the center of the room, had risen to his feet. His chair scraped against the marble floor, an abrupt, jarring sound that only amplified the moment. His face was flushed, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. That was Elijah Carter. Silence. Then a ripple of recognition. At first, confused glances, then gasps, then an explosion of whispers. The name carried through the room, bouncing from table to table, and suddenly, everyone was reaching for their phones, confirming what had just been spoken. And when they did, their expressions shifted, from curiosity to disbelief, from disbelief to something bordering on shame. "He's the one who donated millions to the children's hospital," a woman whispered to her companion, holding up an article, her voice now tinged with reverence. "He built half the properties in this district," another man murmured, staring at his phone as if seeing the world through new eyes. "The founder of Carter Enterprises," someone else added, shaking their head. The weight of realization settled over the room like a thick fog, pressing down on every occupant. The whispers, the glances, the collective judgment, none of it was directed at Elijah Carter anymore. Instead, it turned toward the man who had stood so firmly in his own self-importance, who had spoken without knowing, who had judged without understanding. James Thornton. He could feel their eyes on him now, their quiet condemnation sharper than any words could have been. He had prided himself on his ability to assess people within seconds, to uphold the exclusivity of his establishment, to recognize those who belonged and those who did not. And yet, in his blind pursuit of maintaining an illusion of luxury, he had turned away a man whose worth could not be measured in the fabric of his coat or the shine of his shoes. The realization stung like ice in his veins. The restaurant, once a temple of prestige, now felt unbearably small. James stood frozen near the door, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as though the weight of the moment had settled into his very bones. His mind raced, desperately trying to process the reality crashing down on him. It was as if the ground beneath him had vanished, leaving him floundering in a sea of realization and shame. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, as the memory of his own words echoed cruelly in his head, sharp, dismissive, laced with an arrogance he could no longer justify. A cold wave of panic gripped his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it aloud might lessen the weight of his mistake. His frantic gaze darted to the nearest staff member, his movements jerky, almost desperate. Why didn't anyone tell me? I mean, how was I supposed to know? But his excuses dissolved in the silence that followed. No one rushed to defend him. No one offered words of comfort. The entire room had already passed judgment. A younger patron, the same one who had spoken up earlier, crossed his arms, his expression tight with disappointment. His words cut through James's weak attempts at justification like a blade. You didn't bother to find out. James swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He scanned the faces around him, searching for some flicker of understanding, some nod of sympathy. But all he found were cold, disapproving stares. The very people he had worked so hard to impress now looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. The restaurant, once a symphony of quiet elegance, now buzzed with something far heavier. Murmurs of indignation, whispered accusations, the unshakable presence of an ugly truth laid bare. A waiter hesitated before stepping closer, his voice careful but firm. Sir, should we call Mr. Carter back? Maybe apologize? James latched onto the suggestion like a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. Yes, of course, he blurted, his words tumbling over themselves. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. We'll comp his meal, whatever he wants, just fix it. But no one moved, because it was already too late. Even as James grasped for damage control, the truth settled over him like a suffocating weight. This was not a mistake that could be undone with free meals or forced apologies. The moment had passed. The door through which Elijah Carter had walked out remained shut, and with it, any chance at making things right. In that room filled with wealth and privilege, the true lesson had never been about status or money. It was about respect, dignity, the cost of seeing a person as less simply because of an assumption. And James had failed. He stood there, his polished professionalism now reduced to a hollow shell, fully aware that no frantic scramble could erase what had been done. No one would forget, not the patrons who had watched, not his staff, and certainly not the man who had walked out with his dignity intact. The unease lingered long after Elijah Carter had left. The chandeliers still cast their warm glow. The marble floors still gleamed. The dishes were still plated to perfection. Yet the restaurant no longer felt the same. The elegance, the prestige, it all felt tainted now, wrapped in the remnants of an ugly moment that couldn't be erased. James spent the evening pacing, his usually confident steps now restless and uncertain. Every glance toward the entrance sent a fresh wave of regret crashing over him. The weight of his mistake was unbearable. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the door opened. Elijah Carter stepped inside. A hush fell over the restaurant, thick and almost tangible. It wasn't just that he had returned, it was the shift in energy that came with him. The same man who had been dismissed without a second thought that morning now stood at the threshold, commanding a presence that needed no announcement. He had changed nothing about himself. His clothes remained the same, his posture still exuding quiet strength. Yet it was the shift in the room, the tension, the guilt, that made this moment feel so much heavier. The same patrons who had whispered behind their screens, who had averted their gazes as he was turned away, now sat stiffly in their seats, their discomfort plain. All eyes turned to James. A sickening twist knotted in his stomach. His usually well-rehearsed composure cracked. His instincts screamed at him to fix it, to salvage the situation before it spiraled further beyond his control. He rushed forward, his words tripping over themselves in his haste. "Mr. Carter, he faltered, swallowing hard before forcing himself to continue. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to—" Elijah lifted a hand. A simple gesture. It was enough to silence him completely. The calm in his gaze was more piercing than any raised voice could have been. "You didn't mean to what?" Elijah asked, his voice steady, unshaken. But there was an edge beneath it, something firm, and unyielding. Judge me by my clothes? By my skin? Assume my worth because I didn't fit your idea of what belongs here? James felt his heart hammer against his ribs, each word slicing through him like glass. The room remained deathly silent. Elijah's gaze swept across the diners, his presence filling every inch of the space. This moment was no longer just about him and James. It was about all of them. The problem, Elijah continued, his voice carrying the weight of something deeper than just one insult, isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you thought you already did. You looked at me, and in an instant, you decided I wasn't worthy of being here. You didn't need my name to make that judgment. The silence thickened, pressing down on every person in the room. James parted his lips, but no words came. What could he possibly say? There was no excuse, no justification that wouldn't sound hollow. Elijah turned now, addressing the entire restaurant, his voice unwavering. How many of you saw what happened? How many of you watched a man be dismissed, humiliated, and said nothing? Shame flickered across several faces. You chose silence because it didn't concern you. Elijah's voice was even, controlled, but it held a weight that was impossible to ignore. But prejudice isn't just about the actions of one person. It's about the silence of many. The impact of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. James wanted to look away, to disappear, to undo the choices that had led him here. But there was no escaping the truth. Elijah Carter had walked out that morning with his dignity intact, and in doing so, he had left behind a room full of people who would have to live with the weight of their silence. The weight of Elijah's words hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone present with an almost unbearable force. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their polished facades cracking under the weight of self-reflection. Others averted their eyes, as if refusing to meet the truth staring back at them would somehow absolve them of their silence. But nothing could soften the impact of his quiet yet powerful voice, a voice that carried more weight than any outburst ever could. James finally found his voice, though it was unsteady, raw with remorse. Mr. Carter. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to continue. I made a terrible mistake. I can't begin to express how deeply I regret my actions. Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him, his expression unreadable. A long pause stretched between them before he spoke, his voice measured but firm. Regret is a start, he said, his tone carrying neither anger nor forgiveness, just truth. But change is the next step. How will you ensure this doesn't happen again? Not just to me, but to anyone who walks through that door. The question was not a demand, but a challenge. James nodded quickly, desperation and sincerity tangled in his response. I'll make changes, he vowed. Real ones. Training, new policies, whatever it takes. I promise. Elijah's gaze held his for a long moment, searching for something beyond mere words. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a small nod, the slightest shift in his expression, revealing a trace of understanding. Good, he said simply, because this isn't just about me. It's about making sure this place truly reflects the values it claims to uphold. With that, he turned, his presence still filling the room even as he made his way toward the exit. The restaurant remained silent. No whispered gossip, no resumed conversations, just the deafening hum of unspoken reckoning. The diners, once complicit in their silence, were now left to wrestle with the uncomfortable reality of their inaction. Elijah Carter stepped out of the restaurant with the same quiet dignity he had carried all along. But this time, he left behind something greater than just a lesson. He left behind a truth that could not be ignored. The fallout was swift and merciless. News of the incident spread like wildfire, ignited by social media outrage and headlines that denounced the restaurant's discriminatory actions. The prestigious establishment, once synonymous with exclusivity and refinement, was now the epicenter of scandal. Reservations were canceled en masse. Protesters gathered outside. A boycott was called, and the restaurant's carefully cultivated reputation, built over years of meticulous branding, crumbled in a matter of days. James Thornton, the man whose prejudiced judgment had set everything in motion, bore the brunt of the consequences. The restaurant's ownership, desperate to salvage what remained of their public image, made a swift and decisive move. His dismissal was announced without hesitation. His replacement was chosen with care, someone who not only upheld professionalism but also understood the fundamental necessity of respect and dignity for all. The message was unmistakable. Such behavior would never be tolerated again. While the world expected Elijah Carter to retaliate, to take legal action, to denounce the restaurant in a public spectacle, his response was something far more powerful. Instead of vengeance, he chose grace. Rather than seeking retribution, Elijah redirected his energy toward something far more enduring: change. He announced the creation of a new initiative, one dedicated to providing businesses with comprehensive equality and inclusion training. His program would educate staff, ensuring that no one else would have to endure the humiliation he had faced. His choice was not born of naivety, nor was it an act of forgiveness. It was a statement of purpose, a refusal to let ignorance and prejudice persist unchecked. And the world took notice. What had begun as a controversy transformed into a movement. Businesses took inspiration from Elijah's initiative, implementing their own diversity and sensitivity programs. Conversations that had long been avoided were now being had. Minds that had once been closed were now forced open. Through his actions, Elijah turned his own painful experience into a catalyst for something greater than himself. He proved that true strength is not found in retaliation, but in the ability to foster understanding, to demand better, to build something lasting. He did not need to raise his voice to be heard. His dignity, his unwavering sense of self, spoke louder than any outcry ever could. As Elijah stepped out into the night, his head held high, a quiet reverence followed him. The wealth of those inside that restaurant could be measured in bank accounts and assets, but the wealth he carried could not be bought. A bystander, who had witnessed it all, turned to their companion and murmured, their voice tinged with awe, "Some people show their wealth through money. He shows it through character." The words lingered, settling into the air like an unshakable truth. Inside the restaurant, the patrons remained in their seats, the once luxurious atmosphere now heavy with the weight of their own reflection. The events of the evening would not be easily forgotten. They had seen a man dismissed and humiliated, only to return with a quiet power that had forced them all to confront the depths of their own biases. The story did not end with outrage. It ended with understanding, with a lesson that would echo long after the last candle had burned out. Never judge a person by their appearance. True wealth is not measured by status or possessions. It is found in the kindness we extend, the respect we uphold, and the humanity we choose to see in one another.